Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first One Book, One New Orleans discussion of our 2023 selection, The Ones Who Don't Say They Love You by Maurice Carlos Ruffin. Most of you I see in the Zoom room right now are familiar faces. Thank you, Tad. You're holding up the hard copy version. So I won't do a whole giant spiel about what we do because most of you already know. That being said, I will say that when we distribute hundreds of copies of the book throughout our community, we do make sure that all of those are in paperback because we want as many people to be able to access those as possible. And paperbacks are the editions that are allowed in all facilities that incarcerate our community members. So we're going to get hundreds of the paperback copies to not only incarcerated people, but also adults who are currently working on their literacy skills. They're going to be learning to read using The Ones Who Don't Say They Love You. We're also going to be getting that book into the ears of the blind and print handicapped through a partnership with WRBH Reading Radio. We'll be getting that book into the hands of those who can't afford to buy copies for themselves by making sure the public library has at least 3 copies per branch. And we will also, in order to bring all of these readers from all of these different walks of life together, be having a series of free family-friendly community discussions, both in person and online. And our first one is tonight. This is the first of 5 we will be having bi-monthly from now until the end of October on the 4th Tuesday of each month, which is not always the last Tuesday. So we are really excited that this year, not only is our author a local author, Maurice Carlos Ruffin, he's also a very generous member of the writing community. And part of that writing community is the Podunk Review. And we're so excited that Maurice is a member and that different members of the Podunk Review and the Podunk Writers Alliance will be facilitating these online discussions for us each month, each session. My goodness. The first one is going to be facilitated by the beautiful Tad Bartlett. Tad Bartlett is the managing editor of Podunk Review and the founding member of the Podunk Writers Alliance. He has had fiction and nonfiction published by the Massachusetts Review, the Baltimore Review, the Bitter Southerner, the Online Oxford American, the Chautauqua Literary Journal, the Stockholm Review of Literature, and many others. His work was designated as a notable essay in the 2017 Best American Essays, and his fiction and nonfiction have been Pushcart nominated 4 times. He earned his MFA in fiction from the Creative Writing Workshop at the University of New Orleans, as did Maurice. Welcome, Tad. I am going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Megan. I really appreciate the opportunity to sort of help usher One Book, One New Orleans into this extended book club, I guess you can call it, this year-long book club for Maurice's collection. I'm particularly honored just because I go back a long way with Maurice. He and I started workshopping really bad novel drafts together in about 2005, right before Katrina, and then continued to do that until in 2007, we joined with a few other writers to start the Podunk Writers Alliance. And then I followed his lead into the Creative Writing Workshop at UNO, and we've just continued to do this writing thing together as much as you can, because writing needs community. Up until now, we were talking before we got started about one of the collaborative projects Maurice and I have done, which is this essay called "Kings of the Confederate Road" by the Bitter Southerner, which is linked to it is over there in the chat. And I've had the opportunity so many times, like when his novel was released, and then when the collection came out, to sort of appear with Maurice to do little like question and answer sessions and that sort of thing. But this is the first time we've done sort of this open discussion, and this is going to depend on all of y'all to I mean, like I said, this is like this extended book club, right? And I'm really can't wait to hear the sort of questions and discussion that we can all have together about Maurice's collection. And while he is, not necessarily, this isn't like a presentation by Maurice. He actually may be dropping in at some point during our conversation, so everyone look lively. I would, unless anybody's got some particular like noisy background, in order to make this as discussion oriented as possible, feel free to take off your mute and jump in. I may be sorry for that, and we may decide that we need to mute because of background noise or whatever. But I'd like to start just by sort of finding out, in general, has everybody read some or all of the collection yet?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so that's at least most folks. And I guess I'd like to start with, I've got all these questions written down, probably way too many. Well, I guess I want to start, let's start big. How do these stories and I'm curious what each of y'all think, how did they function as a collection for you? I mean, did you see them, a lot of times a story collection, right, will just be sort of disparate, messages from a writer and they happen to be collected together, but sometimes a collection really comes together and works as a whole. And I want to know, from those of y'all who've made your way through, at least a significant part of the book, how well you thought this works as a whole, or if it indeed is more just a sort of a disparate collection. And I don't think there's one is better than another, but I'm curious what y'all think and why you think one way or the other.
Well, I'll just make a brief. I haven't read all of the stories, but I've read through several. And I found what was so beautiful. One thing is that there were different voices in the different stories, and even some of them were from a male perspective and other were female characters, and yet and the circumstances were different. But I felt that there was same feelings and expressions through all of it, and regardless of the individual character, be it male or female in the setting, and the themes were universal. And so I thought there was a real consistency throughout, even though settings might be different or people might be different by age or race or gender. That didn't matter. It was the fluidity that I found in his expressiveness, and the universality of themes and issues spoke beautifully amidst the stories, be they a one-page story or a 20-page story.
Right. Anybody else have some thoughts on what Gail said?
Well, I was just going to say the common thread that kind of tied them all together was the reoccurring character of the city. The city of New Orleans is this like omnipresent character in every story. And so even though we're time jumping, right, we're in different eras of the city, with different characters and different neighborhoods and different experiences, but the city itself is a character in all of the stories.
Do you feel that that character of the city remains a constant, or does that character kind of shift from story to story? What do y'all think?
Yeah, I feel it. Oh,
no, go ahead.
no, I was gonna say I do feel like it kind of shifted a little bit. Like sometimes it was more prominent than other times. Like sometimes it was there, but not really a character, so to speak. It was just kind of there.
Right.
That's kind of how I look.
Is everybody on here? I guess raise your hand or indicate if you are not someone who has personal familiarity with New Orleans. Okay, so I think everybody does. Did New Orleans ring true to you in these stories, or did it? Or well, that's one question, and a separate question, completely separate, would be, is this a New Orleans you know, or was it a New Orleans for you?
both.
Yeah, I agree.
That's what I was gonna say. There were
Yeah.
some that I was like, oh yeah, I know this, but then there's other times where I was like, oh, this is an experience I haven't had in New Orleans. This is something I don't, putting myself into a different experience through the story.
Was there anything in that felt like it didn't quite ring true, or something that felt more fantastical than realistic in its portrayal, either of the city or of the people, really? Because I know Maurice plays sometimes very subtly with sort of magical realism kind of elements to things. And yet, as a whole, these stories are all not in that vein. And I wonder if folks saw some things that jumped out at them as like just sort of wildly like,
Well, what came to my mind is that a lot of them are experiences that I, as a privileged white woman, have never had. I can imagine the people living in certain situations having those experiences on street corners down in the French Quarter and having to get food or get money or have sex or whatever they have to do. It helped fill it in for me, what some of the reality is that I myself have never experienced and don't really know. I mean, I've read about a lot, but I've never experienced it. He made it seem very real to me, that I could imagine in just a sliver of a way, if you will, what that might be like and how scary that might be, and those places that what that represents.
right. And do you or any of you did you like pick up on some things that Maurice was doing as a writer to make that sort of that reality of it come through, whether it was a situation that you could immediately relate to or was unfamiliar to you? What were some of the things he was doing as a writer to make you just not be completely like walled off from an unfamiliar situation?
Something that stood out to me was his descriptions of food. And like in Before I Let Go, something about her saving half the po' boy, like eating one half, eating the fries, drinking the daiquiri, yet saving the other half of the po' boy. And for some reason that like really stuck in my head as like, oh, I know doing that. Yeah, I do that. And throughout stories, just descriptions of food to me gave it like a grounded feeling.
That's really, now that you say that, I can think to, a handful or two handsful of instances throughout the stories where he does that, but I never picked up on it as a a particular like thing he was doing, but exactly what you're describing. I think that's really interesting. I mean, he does that in so many of these stories. I'm just looking down the list. Whether they're eating at a diner in the French Quarter or in Beg Borrow Steal, that where she goes and is having that burger and talks about how just having that she could go, grab whatever she needed from different like garden plot or whatever, but to have that hot meal, that hot with the crispy onions and that I remember rereading that again over this last week. I was like, wow, I'm salivating actually right now thinking about it. But yeah, those are those kinds of talk about a universal experience. We have universal experiences with food, and gosh, I just love that when somebody says something and it's like a thing that was there all the time and I never really like picked up on it expressly. Are there other things that some of y'all saw that were Maurice did in the writing that helped sort of bring you into the story, whether it's bringing you into a familiar situation or an unfamiliar one?
I think his use of the first person was really powerful in those situations, because it wasn't like he was going out of his way to describe something that might be unfamiliar to the reader, right? His use of the first person, you're in it. immediately from jump. You are absolutely just in the world of this story. And that for me made me sort of use my imagination and put myself there. Whereas maybe if I were reading a more distant sort of third person description, I wouldn't have been.
You know, and there's actually, now that you mention that, there's something else he does with point of view over and over again. He does it in The Ones Who Don't Say They Love You, in that story. He does it in Beg, Borrow, Steal. Made notes on all of them. Few others. He does a second person, and sometimes it's not a real second person, it's like a direct address. And it's almost like that puts you even more directly into the story, you know, because it's not, and yet he does it in this very, very close, tight way where it feels like first person, even though it's actually in second or in this sort of direct address. He does it again in Token.
Mm-hmm.
There's a couple others. But yeah, I just, you don't see that a lot in fiction. You see it more, he does it again in Catch What You Can. I think you see it a little bit more, you know, maybe in the last 10, 15 years, but certainly it's hard to see it done right. I see it, you know, maybe like 10% of the stories, for instance, that get submitted to Podunk Review, are they trying to do something second person or second person-ish, and it's so hard to do it right and to do it well, because it almost sometimes when it's not done well, it creates a barrier, I think, between the reader and the story, because the reader's resisting against that you, because like that you's not me. Did any of y'all feel where Maurice was doing that second person or second person-ish you in at least 5 or 6 of these stories? Did you feel resistance to the you, or because of the way the tone and the syntax and everything, did you feel drawn into it, and like you didn't have resistance to it? You know what I mean by resistance? Like when he's saying you saying as a reader, but that's not me.
I was thrown off on the very first time I encountered it, because I was like wanting to imagine myself in that situation and thinking that's what I was being told to do. And then I was like, wait, no, this doesn't add up. So like once I was like, oh, you know, once it like clicked for me about who he was talking about, then I found it was like deeply engaging to be able to like visualize this character having this journey and what it might feel like. To me, it imparted like a stronger sense of feeling.
Yeah, and it's really how he starts the collection, right? Because that very first story is the title story is in that mode. So it's almost like he's teaching us at the beginning how to read this, because it's going to keep happening. Going back to so the observation that sort of the constant character in this collection is the city. I find it interesting that he starts with the epigraph from Ellis Marsalis: in New Orleans, culture doesn't come down from on high, it bubbles up from the street. And obviously it's like the epigraph's first thing you see when you're, you know, leafing open the book, and it means something, one thing, right, to the reader the first time you read that, and you're not exactly sure what you're going to be getting into. But every time I go back to open the book, I see the epigraph again, and it means something a little bit more, because it feels like Maurice is informed and given definition to the Ellis Marsalis quote. It kind of works both ways, because the epigraph informs the book and the book informs the epigraph. Is this just me overthinking a little sentence at the beginning of the book, or does everybody else kind of wonder that when you get these quotes at the beginning of a book?
I haven't read the book. I just got it from the library today. But I did go through, you know, peruse through the book to read the titles of all the short stories. But when I did read the quote by Ellis Marsalis, I knew that it was going to be a book that I would enjoy, because I felt like I was going to learn more about New Orleans than I knew from living here my whole life. In my life, you know.
Yeah, I think that's
I just love I just think it's a fabulous quote. It's incredible.
Yeah. And just the symbolism of it bubbling up from the street.
Yes.
That creates visual images in my mind of asphalt and something mysterious coming up from the underworld, and be it from the swamp or be it from a more primeval layer. That's what it conjured in my mind, the association for a moment, and that leads you into the other world. And so, yeah, it really captured me too, like you're saying, and the imagery and the symbolism of it. It's not from on high, not that that means celestial, but
Right.
it's coming up, something's coming up, bubbling up from the underworld or from the unconscious mind. And I loved that.
And from the roots, you know, it was
Right.
coming through. And I fell in love with the book when I read that.
And I think it holds that promise, the promise of that quote that you're seeing, Maureen, just, you know, at the beginning of your experience with the book. I imagine that that promise is going to hold as you work your way through it.
It really sets the tone perfectly. You know, it let me know this isn't going to be some detached academic interpretation of what life in New Orleans might be like. It was like, you're about to get the realness. I'm about to serve it to you.
Yeah, you know, this is one thing that Maurice says a lot when he's sort of giving talks on this book, is that growing up, he didn't have anything like this book. He didn't have anything that spoke to the New Orleans he knew, or something that was, and he talks about this with regards to the novel too, is that there were no sort of New Orleans novelists writing about this world and his world and our world in this way that he had ever been exposed to. And so he kind of felt he was going out into this new place. And what he really hopes is that then this sort of bubbling up from the streets thing takes life, and that there'll be more writers who come up telling these stories too. And I've often wondered, you know, when he says that, gosh, is that true? Is there really no other New Orleans novelist or New Orleans fiction writer writing these stories? Has that not happened? Is anybody familiar with other work that might fit within there? Or?
Not in fiction.
Yeah, not in fiction. I mean, certainly plenty in nonfiction.
Yeah. And like Clint Smith in Counting Descent, there's a lot of very sort of New Orleans up from the streets kind of poetry. But
Sure, yeah.
Charisma Price too, her new book has a lot of that.
Yeah, no,
But,
Christmas new book is wonderful.
I can't think of really any fiction writer that does what Maurice does.
Speaking of poetry, there is the I think it's most properly called poem Spinning, which is starts on page 97 of the hardcover. I'm not sure if the pagination holds up in the paperback. Did that really catch anybody for a loop in the process of, I mean, if you read these enough of these and you got to it, in the process of reading all these short stories, you get to this one that's it's either a poem or a prose poem or kind of a hybrid of the two. And talking with Maurice, I know I think it's mainly nonfiction, not fiction as well. Did it fit within the flow of the book for y'all, or did it like really catch you out? And I'm just curious what people's reactions were who have read that one. And I recognize not everybody's necessarily gone through the whole collection yet.
It definitely stood out as a departure from the format, from the rest of the stories. And at the same time, I felt like it fit perfectly.
Mm-hmm. And I think as you know, stepping back from the collection, you know, as sort of a larger same question, but there's this not about poetry and fiction, but about the flash fiction and the smaller short stories, and then also, you know, ending with this novelette sized story. I mean, there's so many different lengths, and I'm always really interested in flash fiction because I've never been able to figure out how to write good flash fiction, and I see so much bad flash fiction as an editor. But I didn't feel any of these were bad, obviously, they're in the book. How did that flow between different size and shaped stories work for y'all as readers? And start there, and then I want to ask some questions specifically about flash fiction.
Yeah, that actually, oh, sorry, I was gonna say that actually threw me off just a little bit. Just because I felt sometimes I'm like, oh, when I got to the end of the story, I was just getting into it and then it was over. And I'm like, oh, I want to know what happens next now. So I mean, I enjoyed it, but I definitely was like, I wish this was longer. I said that a couple of times. Oh, I wish this was longer. I want to know
Are there
what else
some, a couple in particular that you can recall that you wished were longer?
Let me look at this. I know I always say my favorite is Ghetto University. I was just like, what happened after that? You know,
Right.
that wasn't even a short one, you know, that wasn't a short one, but it was just.
I have the exact question written on it, which is, so what happens after the ending of this story? You know?
Right.
And, you know, in general, that's a question that I've got on all these flash fiction pieces, which is, did it feel complete? I mean, I think it's a different thing to want to know more, to want more. I think that's a different question from, is it complete as a thing itself? And if that I think that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so, go ahead, Latoya.
I was just gonna say, because I feel like it was the story that's being told was complete, but I'm curious what else happens.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think
Go ahead, Liz.
that's just a testament to Maurice's ability to create these entirely fleshed out characters that just draw us into the story, you know, using so few words. I don't know how he does it. Almost every single story, I felt like I wanted to keep following that character. You know, I wanted to know what the rest of their life looked like beyond what I was shown.
Right.
I definitely felt that way with Mercury Forges. I mean, there was so much there. Once he gets back in the canoe with his dad, what happens next? Where do they take his dad? Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Gosh, there's the one, unfortunately, I'm not remembering them by title, so I'm flipping through real quick. Oh yeah, here it is. The Places I Couldn't Go, where you've got the character, it's in first person, and the character is talking to, oh, is this the right one? No, that's not the right one.
Oh, that one broke my heart though.
Yeah. Oh yeah, no. And you know, I had the same, is that one a complete story? I feel like if the reaction is you know, it's kind of left me heartbroken, then it did what a story's supposed to do. So the answer must be yes. I mean, I guess it's hard to define what a complete story is when you're asking, is this a complete story? Well, while I'm looking for that one, do people have a favorite? I'm curious, for those of you who've read any of these yet, if you have a favorite.
Mine was Caesara Pittman, or Negress of God, the one where she basically kills him. She gets him off judiciously and then goes and kills him.
Does that appeal to the lawyer in you, Liz?
It does. It does.
I already mentioned my favorite was Ghetto University. It's kind of like these two couples, they're doing their own thing, and then they end up in the same spot and basically have to start all over again. It's like
Right.
someone else is doing exactly what they're doing. So I love that. It was like poetic justice in a way.
Right, poetic justice, and it almost had like this O. Henry kind of quality to it. Uh, you could really see Maurice sort of channeling like these very classical themes in short stories. But yeah, on Caesarea Pittman or Negress of God, my first comment on that one on my note is yes, you know, pure retribution. Because it gives agency in a story where typically when we see this character in a story, they're not given agency at all. And Maurice gives her so much agency and kind of reveals that gradually until the end, when all of a sudden, boom, you know, retribution. Yeah, I like that one. I don't have an answer to the question of a favorite. Because I'll look at one and go, oh yeah, this is it. This is it. I love Beg, Borrow, Steal.
It's Before I Let Go for me.
Before I let go. Let's see. Oh yeah, the last one. Oh yeah, it's so deep and layered and complete. What was it about it for you? Before I Let Go.
I think because it's there are so many elements of the story that I have seen play out in, you know, real life that I just felt like I knew that woman. I was like, oh, she lives down the block, you know, she lives down the street. I know which house that is. It just, yeah, it felt so rooted in the current reality of living in New Orleans.
Yeah, and I feel like that there's so many access points to have that character be relatable for so many readers. I mean, the way Maurice treats parenthood, you know, in that story and dealing with the relationship with the daughter, and it just rings so true. Which is this amazing thing that Maurice can do when he deals with parental relationships. Is channeling those parental relationships to people he knows. Hi, Maurice.
Hey, everybody.
We've been discussing trying to decode what it is you've done here.
Oh boy, I'm not sure I have any answers for you.
One of the, gosh, there's so many questions. One of the things that we kind of touched on was the poem in the middle of the collection. Was it? I'm curious because it is such a departure formally from the rest, from the prose throughout the rest of it. Did you ever have any doubt about including that in the collection?
Yes. I mean, okay. What's the story behind that poem? Is that I've never considered myself a poet. And by the way, thanks for being here, everybody. Thanks, Brother Tad, for doing this. And thank you, Megan and One Book, One Nuance for having this event and the future events as well. I think that anybody who's trying to create art, we tend to lean towards a certain medium, whether it's going to be, you know, prose or memoir or painting or dancing. I think I thought of myself as a prose person, but I would often get comments at events. I'd read something like a passage from a story, and somebody would say, you know, wow, that's so poetic. And even to the point where I would get invited to events and they would mark me as a poet at the event, like on the flyer, Maurice Carlos Ruffin poet will be here. I'm like, wait, I haven't published a poem my entire life, literally. Like, and so that poem was like my first real published poem. And I think in creating it, it's one of those things where if you're fortunate, there are people around you that you can trust. So I made the poem, you know, I showed my editor the poem and I was like, look, if you say it has to go, like we have to cut this poem because it doesn't fit, you know, I'm not quote unquote a poet, and this is a prose book of short stories, take it out. And, you know, to her credit, she's like, no, this is a beautiful piece of art. Just it fits. You know, this is a book of stories, and the poem is a, you know, a narrative poem versus say a more lyric poem. for example. And as I sometimes say, it's probably the most autobiographical story in the entire book, because in a lot of ways, that little kid is me and the guy's my dad. And that actually happened, you know, him driving this truck from the car dealership and spinning it around because of a water slick. So yeah.
Yeah. We had just been sort of going through talking about folks' like favorite story from the collection. But I guess it's probably better to pause that while you're here in the room with us and ask anybody if you have questions that you had while you were reading, or questions, you know, just that you've had about Maurice or about the stories, that you're like, if only I had him in a room with me, I would ask him this thing, because now here he is in a room with you. So
I love questions. And of course, I didn't come here to shut the discussion down. I just wanted to really kind of just say hello and be thankful for this. And you know, if you don't know, you know, Tad is like, he's my brother. I mean, I wouldn't be here without Tad. We've written together for so long, trading stories back and forth. He's a recovering poet. I'm not sure what I am, but I am. And without Tad's support, you know, this book wouldn't exist.
I appreciate that.
So I have a question, and how did you decide the order of the stories, or was that an editor's decision? Because they're so, I mean, they jump from length, they jump through topic, they jump through time. How'd you decide what order they should be in?
Yeah, I mean, I guess this is a night for giving credit to my editor, Nicole Counts, who is the editor at One World Random House. And in fact, she just sent me the edits for my third book on Saturdays. I've been working on that pretty much constantly the past few days. And I trust her so much. So basically what happened was, she says, hey, you know, what order do you want the stories to go in? And I think a lot of authors can say they have similar experiences where deep into the revision process, your brain has turned to sludge and your ability to make decisions becomes less and less capable. And so I said, well, you know, what do you think? I don't know what order these stories should go in. And so she sent me a couple of lists. She's like 2 lists or 3 lists. It's like, try, what about this order, and that order? And the only advice I had was, well, how about this? You know, my style is that I like my stories to kind of start off fast and maybe a little bit light, a little bit funny or whatever, and then kind of get, you know, darker or more distorted or whatever later on. So what if the collection is kind of built in the same shape? In other words, I want the first part of whatever I do to be like an eye catcher, a head turner. And so she picked the title story as the first story. And certainly I think it's a story that's gotten, you know, a lot of play amongst readers because it's a good calling card as a writer. I think that anybody who writes has, you know, 1 or 2 calling cards where people kind of say, you know, I read this one story one time. Wait, you wrote that one? That kind of thing. So it does that. And certainly it's the kind of story where there's enough, I would say, like difficulty in it, where, you know, if say, for example, you're a very sensitive reader, it kind of warns you, you know, do you want to read a collection that has these kinds of thoughts about, you know, physical attacks and children in danger? And do you want to pace yourself, you know, 1 story a day or 1 story a week, that kind of thing. So I think it's been helpful in that, and the collection has been doing very well. I think that's in large part to Nicole's selection. And then also, you know, she made the choice to put the novelette, the longest story, at the end, which is also, I think, smart, because I think sometimes if you put like a novelette or a novella in the center, people kind of get stuck on that mountain and they can't get past it, and they don't finish the book, you know. So I think in a lot of ways, I didn't realize until after she made the order that last story is almost like a sort of combination of all the other stories' themes. You know, people trying to make it, people caring for each other in difficult situations, trying to build a future with each other, and so, you know, that story, which has Delia as the main character, has a lot of that sort of energy, and even to the point where she sort of visits different scenes in the other stories at certain points, you know, going to like a park in this part, or, you know, going to a hotel in this part, that kind of thing. So yeah. Thanks, Megan.
Anybody else have questions you've always wanted to ask Maurice?
I do, and it could be that I'm missing something, but why was that story called Rhinoceros?
Oh, thank you for that question, Liz. I think that most people who write fiction are often inspired by other stories or other novels or, you know, other pieces of art, and I'm certainly guilty of that. Writing teachers always say, including my mentor, James Nolan, he said, look, amateurs are influenced by other authors, but real writers steal. And that's like a 3,000-year-old saying at this point. So that story was, I kind of outdid myself. I didn't just steal from one story, I stole from like 5 stories. So Rhinoceros, let me try and sort out in my own mind. So Rhinoceros, in part, is built on a Murakami story, a Brian Washington story, and a Hemingway story. So Murakami has this story. I can't think of the title, but basically it's easy to find like online because I think it's in the New Yorker. It's a story about a Japanese man who is kind of depressed and his wife wants to divorce him. And this lady who he works with kind of likes him. And so she invites herself on his trip to bring this mysterious box to a cousin in the country. And so he's in the car with these 2 Japanese ladies and they're kind of making fun of him and he kind of misses what they're trying to say about him. And it's implied that he's not really good in a social situation. So then Brian Washington makes his own version of that story. So Brian has a story also in the New Yorker that's almost the exact same plot. There's a young man who I think he's Black, he's in Japan. There's a couple of girls, yada, yada, yada. And then I'm like, okay, that's interesting. And I was like, that inspired the scene where Freddie and gets into the car with the 2 guys, B and the other guy. And there's this weird conversation where, like, I think Freddie feels really endangered for good reason, because these are adults and they're, just out of being children, basically. So there's that aspect of it. But then the Rhinoceros part is straight from Hemingway. Now, he has a story called The Brief and the Short and Happy Life of Francis Macomber. I think that's the proper title of it. And, spoiler alert, it's about a short and happy life. So the guy doesn't make it through the end of the story. He is on a safari in Africa and his wife can't stand him. And there's this sort of a Vice President Dick Cheney moment where the wife gets the gun on the safari and points it at Francis and bad things happen. Meanwhile, there's a rhinoceros in the background getting ready to run over him and the wife. So I'm like, okay, how can I just not take the plot, not take the characters, but just take the image? So if you look real closely on that last page, and it's like, it's so subtle, you really shouldn't see it unless you're looking for it. The vehicle is a rhinoceros. Like, it is a silver gray, gigantic, heavyweight SUV with a little hood ornament. It's like a horn. And that's it. It's like charging at the 2 main characters. Like, it's like snorting, there's like the exhaust coming out. So it's one of those like little like metaphorical, elusive type things that I just threw in there just for, as Horace, the ancient poet, would say, the purpose of prose and poetry is to like teach and delight. So I'm either like trying to teach or just like have a little fun sometimes. So that's what that image is all about.
It wasn't the Smashing Pumpkins song Rhinoceros that
as much as I love the Pumpkins and that song, I wasn't thinking about that very much, although maybe I was subconsciously.
Right. I've got a question, but I don't want to get in the way of anybody else. Anybody else have questions for Maurice?
We love questions. And thanks for the links in the chat box.
Here's a question, Maurice, that we've talked about this sometimes privately, just about how difficult this is. But I think it's useful to, every time writers talk about this question, there's always a different answer. And so anyway, here's the question. In the collection, throughout the collection, you were writing so many different places and so many like very close points of view with women, men, Black characters. You're dealing with sexuality in different ways. And so your characters are coming from places, not all of which are places that you, Maurice, come from. How do you, and yet it works, right? Yeah. At least me as a reader, one reader in this room, I never felt like I didn't believe that character, right? How do you put yourself into a different life experience and write authentically as if from that different life experience? What are the tricks you employ?
Yeah, no, thank you for that question, brother. And so I spend a lot of time like reading like craft books and listening to like podcasts about history. There's this podcast I love called Literature and History. So I literally listened to it like 10 minutes ago, which is why it's on top of my mind right now. But so this poet Horace, who I didn't learn about in high school or college at all, because I went to public schools, yada, yada, yada. Horace is the guy that wrote the Ars Poetica. like the art of poetry, in like 40 BC. And so he was talking about, he said when he started out as a poet, he was Roman, so he spoke Latin. But all of his heroes in poetry were Greeks from the previous like centuries. So he wanted to write Greek poetry. And he says, and he's kind of like a smart aleck, he says, I sat down on the first night of writing poetry to write a Greek language poem. And then a Roman goddess appeared to me and said, only a fool would try to carry timber into a wood. I'm like, huh? And I think the point of that is like, your job as a writer is to try to do things that make sense, whatever that means. And so for me, it makes sense to write my community. And my community is New Orleans primarily. Of course, I'm a world citizen, an American citizen, but the people that I have encountered in my life, it's these concentric circles from my immediate family, which was, mostly Black, mostly straight, mostly working class, to the people I went to school with and worked with, to my church community, to the people that I met when I became a writer, which expanded my circles, including meeting you as a lawyer. And so what happens is when you try to recreate your community, you have this familiarity. I mean, I'm not saying that I could like create a perfect, I think Aristotle read Horace and used it in his, probably. I may have the years out of whack, but I'm not an expert. I'm responding to the chat. But my point being, like, if somebody told me, Maurice, like try to write like a Tad Bartlett like character, I could probably pull that off. I know you very well, and vice versa. You know me very well. Like my tics and my obsessions and my weird little points and that kind of stuff, right? I think what happens is that, one of the great challenges in modern America is that we want to address all these injustices that involve things like racism and misogyny and patriarchy and homophobia and anti-trans ideologies. But it can be very difficult if you don't have anybody in your circles who fit those classifications. If you don't have any friends who, for example, are, I don't know, Korean, for example, or somebody who is a transgender man, for example, you try and write about it. I look very much to people like Roxane Gay, who in the past has been, very, very, very critical of people who sort of write outside of their, might say comfort zones. But she was interviewed about a year ago. I think it was on an NPR show. And somebody asked her about some more recent book that had come out. And she said, I have no fault with this book because the writer did a good job. And the interviewer was surprised. I was surprised as a listener. And she says, look, it's what you can pull off. If you're good at it, nobody's going to call you on it. And I think about me when I was in school myself. There was a short story anthology called New Stories from the South. This is around 2009, that year's anthology. And there was a story in that book from the point of view of a middle-aged Black man who works in an AIDS halfway house in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, so outside of my city. And I remember reading the entire story and kind of going, that's a pretty good story. Again, main character is middle-aged Black man. I flipped to the back and the writer was like a 25-year-old white young woman who probably had gone to LSU. And I'm like, how did she pull that off? Now, I can't be mad at that. I can't be upset that she pulls it off. If she pulls it off, I'm like, thank you. I appreciate that. I just think that one of the problems is that I often say to people who like want to write outside of sort of like their communal experience or outside of what they have observed, like people are in your life, but you haven't had these interactions to understand them very well, is that you really just need to pay a lot of attention, read a lot of books, have a lot of conversations, and be ready for some heartburn and difficult interactions and challenging your assumptions. And to give one last example, every once in a while, just to make myself grimace, I will go on like Amazon.com and look at like the best-selling books, the top 20, top 50, top 100. And I was looking at like top, African-American books. And I was like, oh, I know that author, and that's a pretty good book over there. And then one of the covers like just leapt out at me. And the cover was this this kind of older Black lady, like wearing this kind of like ragtag sort of like dress in front of this like beat down shack. I'm like, oh, this is like a slave narrative type book, even though it's written by a modern author. And the little voice in my head said, oh, I bet the lady who wrote this is probably a middle-aged or older white lady. Not to be insulting, but I clicked on it and sure enough it was. And what that told me was this: there are very few people from like my community who are trying to tell a story about that time period who would say, look how poor this character was. Look how much she suffered. Look how, uneducated she was. If I'm writing like my great grandmother's story, like I want to show her in like this from the spirit of love. You know, she's like, you know, maybe with the grandkids, like on a Sunday, you know, on the cover when they have, you know, at church with the pastor or something like that. Or she's like, you know, wrapping, you know, a bandage around like her adult son's arm because he got hurt, something like that. And so it's just a matter of like, it's not just how you tell the story, but it's what you care about in the stories and what you're trying to say, as opposed to, you know, again, the outside perspective makes you want to make it overly dramatic and less humane and less direct. So it's a hard question. I don't want to ever censor anybody, but I will always, you know, challenge people's assumptions for why they want to tell things that they don't have any personal experience with.
Did you, in writing some of these stories that where you're writing from a different experience, did you feel a lot of doubt, or did you feel you were pretty well plugged in as you were writing it?
I felt probably 80-20, which is to say, a lot of these characters are based on people that are near and dear to me. So for example, Rhinoceros probably comes from the experiences I had with like my high school friends and acquaintances, some of whom were close, most of whom were not very close. But I mean, Shaquan in that story is basically just Big Frida. I mean, look at how like she talks and acts and moves, you know. Freddie is kind of like some people I've known in my life, including some current friends who are like kind of non-binary, but because it's New Orleans, they don't call it that. You know, they're just kind of like who they are. So maybe they were assigned woman at birth, but they kind of come across as more like the middle of the sort of gender spectrum, that kind of thing. And for me, you know, I don't ever want to cause harm with my work. I don't want to like make anybody feel like they're worthless. And so, you know, I was putting the book out, and I'll never forget, again, the book was coming out, and Roxanne Gay has this Goodreads page where she just reviews, you know, dozens of books every single month, it seems like. And so she had reviewed my first book, and she's a blurb on one of the covers of the hardcover of We Cast a Shadow. And so I just saw, like, before the collection came out in August, in June, she pops up on Goodreads reviewing my book. And I'm like, oh boy. And I'm thinking she's reading this book. There's quite a few queer characters, you know, so forth and so on. What's she gonna say about it? And I just like opened up the website, read her review, and it's like just big sigh of relief. I'm like, all right, if Roxanne is okay with it. And then later on, about 2 months later, Kiese interviewed me after the book came out. He asked the same question, like, how did you do this, bro? Like, how did you pull this off? Because he's like, I'm not sure I can do it myself. I'm like, it's our people, right? It's our community. He's like, man, look, you did that. I'm like, all right. So if both Roxanne and Kiese are like, you did all right, I'm like, okay, thank you. That's all I need to hear. And also, I mean, it's been wonderful to get people like DMing me in like my IG, sending messages saying, hey, you know, thank you for this. Somebody had a friend that was undergoing gender reassignment surgery, and they asked me to sign it so they can mail it to New Jersey to the person in their hospital room. And then I got a picture like on Instagram of them like holding the book a few months later, you know, saying thank you with my acknowledgement inside of it. I'm like, you know, of course, obviously. And so, you know, my job is just to be representative. It's not about me with like some ideology. It's about, you know, who do I know? What have I seen? What are their stories like? And certainly, you know, from our city, New Orleans in particular, where so many stories are underrepresented, you know, as much as I appreciate and respect and have love for, you know, our predecessors like a Tennessee Williams or a Faulkner, you know, the fact of the matter is that their bandwidth was only so wide. And we've spent many decades, you know, praising them. But of course, there's so many other stories to be told. And this is my last Horace hat tip for the night, is that he also said, he said, look, you know, I came up on Homer and I don't know, Archimedes and these various other like Greeks and Romans of the past, but I will never ever act as if like they are the end all be all of what writing is. The job of literature is be renewing itself constantly. We must pay respect to the new writers who are coming up, who are just getting started and just trying to lead them along the path so they're supported and we get more stories. And so I'm of the exact same mindset. If somebody looks at my story and challenges it, I'm like, thank you for that. I appreciate it. And I write your own version of the story. I want to see what you have to say about this in your own words, because that is better for all of us to have more voices being heard.
Certainly. Well, thanks so much, Maurice, for popping in. Before you pop out, anybody else have a question for Maurice or comment? Okay.
Well, thank you all so much. Again, I appreciate you all for taking the time and effort. I'll be around if you need me. I'm sure I'll come to some of the later events, and have a good night.
See you, Maurice.
Thank you, Maurice.
So Megan, I know when we were talking about this, it was like 45 minute to an hour sort of thing. So I don't want to hold people over and delay, but this feels like we've only begun. I mean, I've got 20 gajillion of these little slips of paper with questions on them, and I've gone through maybe 2 of them. But there are going to be these events happening, as you said, throughout the year, every 2 months, right? Fourth Thursday of every other month.
Yep, and that's just the online events. We're gonna have a bunch in person as well, because can't stop, won't stop, right?
So my thinking is, as we're doing this, is that, you know, going into it, I thought, oh, well, this will be great because you'll have like a different event with a different group of people each time. But I don't know. I feel like this needs to be a cumulative, like keep the stone rolling down the hill kind of thing until like the last one's going to have 100 people and 5 screens of Zoom gallery. But I would encourage everybody to keep your eye out, and you're not going to get a repeat the next time. It's going to build, right?
Mhm.
I hope I
Yeah,
didn't
and
just
one thing we're
hijack the
gonna
whole vision
do-
for your whole vision for this.
No, one thing we're gonna do, Tad, is this recording will be available on YouTube. So anyone who missed tonight can catch up and then jump right in. We can relive those conversations if we've had them again. I personally want to go look up the short stories Maurice was referencing, and I can do that now because of the YouTube video.
Right. And so there will be a little bit of a thread of continuity through them. There's going to be not me, but a different person from the Podunk Writers Alliance within each of these, sort of facilitating the conversation, which I think is great because we all bring something different to our relationship with Maurice and to our relationship with writing. So there's that to look forward to as well. Anybody have anything? I mean, we're at an hour, but I don't know if there's a hard pulling of the plug. Anybody have something that they want to dig into before we leave this evening? Okay. Well, I'm going to definitely be attending more of these because I'm going to bring my little slips of paper with me. So whoever our next facilitator is has that to look out for. Well, thank you everybody for bringing your thoughts to this. This has been a really fun conversation.
And
Thank you,
just so you
Tad.
guys know what to look forward to next, we've been talking about flash fiction. I'm really excited that came up because the next thing we're doing is March 31st, and that will be a flash fiction workshop inspired by the ones who don't say they love you. And that facilitator will be Anel Lopez. We're partnering with Liminal Lit for that workshop. So stay tuned to the One Book One New Orleans pages and our mailing list, and you'll get all of the information about that. That one will be in person.
Yeah, she's a fantastic fiction writer and flash fiction writer, so that'll be great.
She is, and we just got to publicly see today that her book is going to drop February 2024 because she just won the first book prize from Feminist Press.
Right.
So snaps to Anel today.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Megan. Thank y'all all
Thank
for coming.
you.
All
Thank
right.
you, Tad.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Sure.